I remember the square in Prague. The year was 1583. Folks weren't gathering for a market or a festival that day. No music, no chatter of trade. They'd come for something darker, something meant to be witnessed rather than celebrated. A punishment. Right in the middle of the square stood a wooden frame. It wasn't fancy, just rough timber put together for one grim purpose. Hanging from the top beam was a heavy iron hook, big as a man's hand, rocking a little in the cold wind. You could tell at a glance it wasn't made for farming or building. Every curve of that hook had been shaped for one thing, to tear into human flesh. Its tip was sharpened just enough to sink into muscle, and the whole design made sure that when a person was hung from it, they wouldn't die quickly. Death would come slow, drawn out, and in full view of everyone. That was the hammer hook, part execution device, part torture tool, used all across Europe from the 1200s up through the 1700s. It wasn't like a rope that snapped your neck in seconds, or an axe that ended things cleanly with one blow. No, this was worse. The condemned were lifted by a hook that pierced under the jaw, between the ribs, through the belly, wherever the executioner decided. They hung there, bleeding out, dying inch by inch from pain, shock, and exposure. Sometimes it took hours, sometimes days. Today, I'm looking back at that instrument, how it was made, how it was used, and what it says about the kind of world that could turn death into a public show. The hammer hook, or Fleirant as it was called in German, started out as a butcher's tool. It was used to hang animal carcasses, and somewhere along the way people decided to use it on each other. To them, certain criminals weren't really human anymore, just meat displayed as a warning. A typical hook was forged from solid iron, thick in the stem for strength, wide in the curve to catch the body, and sharp at the tip to pierce it. Most ran about 10 to 15 inches long, big enough to hold the weight of a grown man without bending. Some were single-pointed, others had 2 or 3 hooks to keep the victim from slipping free. You could find them bolted into wooden posts, stone walls, even town halls, a constant reminder of what happened to those who crossed authority. How the hook was used depended on the crime, the region, and the temperament of the executioner. Sometimes they'd drive it under the ribs, pushing between the bones without hitting the vital organs. The victim would be lifted sideways, their own weight slowly ripping their flesh apart until the blood loss and pain finally killed them. Other times, the hook went under the jaw, punching through the mouth or throat and out near the top of the head. That death came quicker, though no less brutal, choking, bleeding, or suffocating in a matter of minutes or hours. The cruelest variation was when the hook was forced into the abdomen or back, piercing organs but carefully missing the heart and lungs. That meant a slower death, the body bleeding inside itself. Every choice, where to pierce, how to lift, was deliberate, matched to the crime and the rank of the condemned. Traitors, heretics, or those who went against the church usually got the worst of it. Even the placement of the hook had meaning. Under the rib, that marked betrayal like a dagger between the ribs. Through the mouth, punishment for blasphemy or lying. In the belly, a message about greed or lust. It turned an execution into a kind of stage play, a gruesome moral theater where the human body told the story of sin and authority. Records show that this wasn't rare. Across Europe, from Amsterdam to Nuremberg, the hammer hook had its place. In Amsterdam, some hooks were fixed right to the outer walls of the Waag, a public building used for weighing goods, where criminals were hung for everyone to see, a grim lesson for the living. In Nuremberg, a city infamous for its torture devices, hooks were stored among the executioner's tools in a tower called La Fans, alongside other instruments of punishment and death. Records from trials held in Prague, Vienna, and other cities of the Holy Roman Empire tell us that executions by hook weren't rare. They were mentioned often, especially during the years of the religious wars, those bitter times when Catholics and Protestants hunted and punished each other with shocking creativity. One of the most notorious cases took place in 1535, in the German city of Münster, during the Anabaptist Rebellion. When the Catholic forces of the Prince-Bishop finally retook the city, they wanted to make an example. The rebel leaders were captured and publicly executed in a way meant to freeze terror into everyone who watched. Jan van Eyden, the man who had crowned himself King of the New Jerusalem during the revolt, was tortured with red-hot hooks for over an hour before he finally died. His followers, Bernard Keeper-Dalling and Bernard Krekking, suffered the same fate. After their deaths, The bodies of all three were locked inside iron cages and hung from the tower of St. Lambert's Church, each suspended on hooks high above the city. Their corpses stayed there for decades, rotting away, the cages turning into grim reminders of what rebellion and heresy would cost you. Even now, those cages still hang there, empty, rusted, but visible, a haunting echo of that cruel time when faith and politics mixed in blood. But the hook wasn't always used just to kill. Sometimes it served as a torture device during interrogations, when captors wanted a confession more than a corpse. A prisoner could be hoisted onto the hook for a few moments, their own body weight ripping into the wound, then lowered down for questioning. If they refused to talk, up they went again over and over until they either confessed, passed out, or died. There was already a method called strappado, where ropes were used to suspend a victim by the arms, but using hooks took that cruelty even further. The hook tore through skin and muscle, leaving lifelong scars, if the victim survived at all. Those who lived carried the marks of it forever, walking testaments to what justice could mean in those days. The reasoning behind such public cruelty was complicated. These executions weren't just punishments, they were performances with layers of meaning. First, they were meant to scare people. The message was simple: commit a crime and this could be you. Second, they acted as a kind of public repair, restoring order by punishing whoever had broken it right in front of everyone. Third, they reminded people who held the real power: the church, the state, the rulers who could decide life or death with no appeal. And finally, though it's hard to admit, they were entertainment. Crowds came from all walks of life to watch. Merchants, peasants, nobles. These executions became social gatherings, where people bonded over shared fear and fascination, their sense of morality reinforced by the spectacle of someone else's suffering. Still, not everyone was comfortable with it. Even back then, some thinkers and theologians spoke out. Michel de Montaigne, the French essayist, wrote about feeling sickened while watching executions, saying that true civilization wasn't shown by how we treated good citizens, but by how we treated those who'd fallen short. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the Dutch humanist, said much the same, that such brutality was beneath a moral society. But those voices were few. Most people believed that harsh justice was necessary, even righteous. It wasn't until the 18th century that things began to change. The Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking about justice, punishment, and human dignity. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria, in his 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments, argued fiercely against torture and the death penalty. His words rippled through Europe, influencing kings and lawmakers alike. Slowly, the cruelest punishments faded away. Enlightened rulers began replacing them with what they called more humane methods. And then came 1792, the year the guillotine was introduced during the French Revolution. Unlike the hook, it was meant to be clean, quick, and almost painless. A cold machine designed not to terrorize but to end life swiftly. In its way, it was the beginning of modern justice, though the shadow of the old ways still lingered. Over time, executions changed. Hanging, for instance, was refined so the drop broke a person's neck instantly instead of leaving them to choke slowly. Little by little, public executions disappeared from open squares and moved behind the closed walls of prison courtyards. Society began to realize that turning death into a spectacle wasn't the mark of civilization. And so, somewhere between the 18th and 19th centuries, the executioner's hook, much like the guillotine that replaced it, faded from official use. Still, revenge, mob justice, and secret punishments sometimes kept the old cruelty alive in the shadows. The last officially recorded execution by hook in Europe probably happened near the end of the 1700s, though no one can say exactly when. Records from that time are spotty. What's certain is that by the 19th century, European governments, at least publicly, had declared such punishments barbaric. They were done with them, at least on paper. Even so, the hooks didn't vanish entirely. You can still find them in museums across Europe. In Rothenburg ob der Tauber, Germany, the Medieval Crime Museum keeps several examples on display. The Torture Museum in Amsterdam has one mounted on a wagon, showing how it might have been used centuries ago. Of course, those exhibits spark debate. Some people say these museums turn real suffering into spectacle, sanitizing brutality through the distance of time and exaggerating the horrors just to draw tourists. Others argue the opposite, that keeping these relics visible forces us to face our past honestly, to remember what human beings are capable of when cruelty becomes normal. Archaeologists have added another layer to that understanding. Excavations of old execution sites have unearthed not just remnants of wooden frames or metal fittings, but human bones marked by trauma, punctures, fractures, and tears consistent with what the old records describe. Those findings give the stories physical weight. They turn history from words on paper into something you can see and touch, undeniable proof of what once was. But the legacy of the executioner's hook goes beyond a single object. It represents an entire mindset, a time when punishment wasn't only about stopping crime or protecting society, but about making a person suffer as much as possible, right up to the moment they died. Over the centuries, we've come to reject that philosophy, at least in theory. Modern justice claims to stand on three pillars: fairness, human dignity, and the hope of rehabilitation. Still, that rejection isn't absolute. The arguments haven't gone away, we just have new versions of them. The death penalty, the use of torture in interrogations, the treatment of prisoners and terrorists. These are all modern echoes of the same old struggle between vengeance and humanity. The hook, in a way, reminds us how easily tools can be twisted toward cruelty. It started as something ordinary, a butcher's implement meant to hang meat. Then, through the logic of power and dehumanization, it became a means of execution. That transformation should give us pause. Because history shows that once a society decides certain people are less than human, almost any invention, no matter how harmless, can be turned into an instrument of pain. We see it even today. Medical technology adapted for torture, farming chemicals turned into weapons, surveillance tools used to repress rather than protect. The lesson of the executioner's hook isn't just about the past. It's a warning about the present. For the countless souls who died hanging from those iron hooks, there was no redemption, no philosophical comfort, only unbearable pain and a crowd watching. Their bodies were displayed as warnings, their deaths turned into messages. But their memory, kept alive in old documents, museums, and bones unearthed from the ground, still speaks. It forces us to confront what people can do when cruelty becomes normal. It reminds us how fragile civilization really is, how easily it can slip backward. And it urges us never to forget the importance of human rights, due process, and the simple decency of treating even the worst among us with a shred of dignity. The executioner's hook stands as a dark monument, a reminder of the path we must never walk again.